Here we are, ready to start in on part two of four sets of notes that are tied together because they're coming from the chapter 16 material. I do want to alert you, I posted this on Canvas where I had originally said you're going to be responsible for all four sets of notes. I just don't think that's feasible for me to do a good job with, and so therefore not for you either. And I will clarify this to the best of my ability in both an announcement on Canvas as well as in postings on Canvas. So you are, however, responsible for this material. So what are we doing? Again, remember the broad outline of the Chapter 16 material is dealing with exchange rate determination. And we're in a position where we can kind of learn some new stuff as well as tie some previous stuff together. But what we're going to focus on today is the real exchange rate. And then what we'll do in the next set of notes that you will be responsible for the individual and team quizzes this weekend is item number 4, and then item number 5 will shove off to the week 9 set of material. So if you recall from the previous set of notes, we were talking about what happens when there is a nominal appreciation of the dollar, or a nominal depreciation of the dollar. And what we said in that material, or in the previous set of notes, is that other things equal, if the dollar appreciates relative to another country's currency, then that should be something that would reduce US net exports and would as well potentially then slow the level or reduce the level of gross domestic product. And so what we were left with in the previous set of notes was this sort of cryptic slide here that says, well, yes, but it depends on the real exchange rate. So before digging into this question of the relationship between exchange rates and net exports, and before formally defining what we mean by a real exchange rate, let's consider an example that we're going to use for the primary example over the course of this set of notes, and go back a little bit as a springboard to going forward. So here's our example. You're a purchasing manager for General Electric, and you need to decide whether you need to buy stainless steel. So, should you buy the ton of stainless steel that you require from a supplier in China, where the price is 14 yuan per ton, or should you buy from a supplier in Pittsburgh in the United States, where the price is $3,000 per ton? And I'm telling you to suppose that the exchange rate is $1 trading for 7 yuan. So again, in notation terms, that would be that the exchange rate is 7 what? 7 yuan per dollar. So our question is, what should you do? Should you buy from China, or should you buy from Pittsburgh? And in order to get a handle on this, what I want you to appreciate is that there's lots of different equivalent ways of thinking about arriving at an answer to this question. So, one thing that you could do to figure out whether you should buy steel from the Pittsburgh supplier or from the Chinese supplier is to compare the US price, or excuse me, to compare the dollar price of US steel and Chinese steel. So we know that in the United States, a ton of steel is going to cost $3,000. But what we need to do to make this comparison is to calculate the dollar price of Chinese steel. So the dollar price of the ton of Chinese steel. And this is going to be a calculation much like what we were doing before. What we would do is recognize that this is going to be equal to 1 over the nominal exchange rate times the price, the price of the price of steel in China. So again, just to kind of be clear on this, this is going to be 1 over what? This is going to be yuan per dollar. And our price of steel is going to be yuan per ton of steel. And so what we're going to come up with, the two Chinese currencies, the yuan, are going to cancel out, and we're going to come up with a measure that is expressed in dollars per ton of steel. But this would be the dollar price of Chinese steel. So specifically, what we would be doing is taking 1 over 7 yuan per dollar, and we would be multiplying that by the price of Chinese steel. So that would be 14,000 yuan per ton of Chinese steel. And so if you do that, basically what you're doing is dividing 7 into 14,000, and and so that should give you $2,000 per ton of Chinese steel. And so right away, we have the first of several instances in which we're going to see that the best thing for you as the purchasing manager is to purchase the steel from China. And the reason for that is that if you buy steel from China, the dollar equivalent of that is $2,000, which is, of course, less than the price of US steel, which itself, of course, is $3,000 per ton. So we know that the answer is in this example is buy steel from China. And so remember that, and essentially what we're going to be doing is thinking about different ways to arrive at that very same answer. So another way that we could do this is basically the flip of option A, and that is to compare the price of US and Chinese steel, but not in dollars, instead in yuan. So in order to do that, we can say that we want to figure out the yuan price, so the price in the Chinese currency of US steel. And so what is that equal to? That is equal to the nominal exchange rate times the price, in this case of steel, but the steel that's coming from the US. And again, just to check that we have our units right, this is going to be yuan per dollar times dollars per ton of US steel. And so the dollars are going to cancel out, and you're going to get yuan per ton of US steel. So in particular, this would be 7 yuan per dollar. That's our nominal exchange rate that we're told. And the price of US steel is $3,000 per ton of US steel. And what do we come up with? This is $21,000 per ton of, too lazy to find the eraser and screw this all up. So this is, 21,000 yuan per ton of US steel. So that means that if we were making the comparison, we would observe that we could purchase steel from China for 14,000 yuan, and the equivalent of buying that steel from the United States would mean that we were paying 21,000 yuan. So this is greater than the Chinese price, or the yuan price of Chinese steel. So again, we're left with the observation that what we should be doing is buying this steel from China. So we have two equivalent ways of figuring out what should be done in terms of this purchasing decision. Now, this is probably if you had one good, two countries, one exchange rate. This is probably the easiest way to gauge the relative competitiveness of uh, of one country's stuff. You would be looking at it on a goods by goods basis. But there's a third way to determine the answer to what should you do, and that is to calculate a real exchange rate. And this is going to be, as I said, probably more complex than taking one of these two methods for a problem as simple as this. But if we wanted to gauge the overall competitiveness of an economy, it would be tedious to look at all of the myriad of goods and services that an economy could produce. And what we want to do is have more of an aggregate measure. And so the real exchange rate that we're going to ultimately talk about is one that we would think of as a measure of aggregate competitiveness. So what I want to do is first of all define what I mean by the real exchange rate, but then we'll consider this in the example of this purchasing manager. So, what is the real exchange rate? Well, real in this context is used in exactly the same manner that we used when we talked about real GDP, when we talked about real interest rates, and so forth. Anytime we use this adjective of real, what we're talking about is making an adjustment for purchasing power or making an adjustment for prices and inflation. So, the real exchange rate is adjusting the nominal exchange rate for differences in currencies' purchasing power arising from differences in prices in countries. So, one of the things that we'll work our way towards is showing that the real exchange rate is telling us the rate at which we could trade real goods and services in one economy for another. So in other words, the real exchange rate, as we'll see, is describing the rate at which one country's output is going to trade for another country's output. And this is important because the nominal exchange rate is merely showing us the rate at which you can trade one country's currency for another country's currency. But once you have that other country's currency, if prices are really, really high, then you don't have as much purchasing power. And so what the real exchange rate is doing is capturing that for us. It's recognizing that you can trade nominal currencies, but then the set of goods and services that you're able to buy is going to be determined by prices in the respective economies. And so this is really going to get at when if you've traveled internationally and you walk away from your trip and you say, "Oh wow, stuff was really expensive there." In a gut sense. I mean, maybe you worked out the math, but in a gut sense, what you're saying is, if another country was an expensive place to be, it means that after you converted, say, the dollar into that country's currency, it just didn't go as far. You couldn't buy as much in the way of goods and services. And that's kind of what, again, we're capturing with this notion of the real exchange rate. So here again is our problem. You're a purchasing manager. You're trying to decide whether you should buy a ton of stainless steel from China versus the supplier in Pittsburgh, and you're told the nominal exchange rate. So our formula for the real exchange rate is so again my notation, it's I'm introducing it, it's not something that's in the textbook, is this lowercase e for the nominal exchange rate, and then I'm just putting the subscript of real under it to denote that we're talking about the real exchange rate. And so what the real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate adjusted for differences in prices in the two countries. And so what I want to do is convince yourself or convince us, first of all, that this is true. So what are we capturing? So the real exchange rate is the number of yuan per US dollar. And so yuan per US dollar, that's the nominal exchange rate. What is the price in the US? Well, if we're going to take this very specific example of steel, it would be the dollars that you have to pay per ton of US steel, and the price in China would be yuan per ton of steel. And so if you kind of screw your eyes up and you look at this, you can see that we have a bunch of fractions. US dollars is in the denominator in the exchange rate. It's in the numerator in the second term. Uh, that didn't help. Yuan is in the numerator in the nominal exchange rate. It's in the denominator of this second term. And then we can flip the denominator of the here, we can flip this, and what we're left with is tons of Chinese steel per ton of US steel. So this is what I mean when we're saying that the US, or excuse me, the real exchange rate is telling us the rate at which we can trade one country's goods for another country's goods. So let's plug in some numbers here. So what is the real exchange rate in this numerical problem? Well, again, this is 7 yuan per dollar. The price in the United States is $3,000 per ton of US steel. And in China, it's 14,000 yuan per ton of Chinese steel. So what are we left with? We are left with then 2,100 per ton of US steel divided by, of course, 1,400. Now our units are gone per ton of Chinese steel. And if we do that division problem, what we're left with is the real exchange rate is equal to 1.5. 1.5 what? 1.5 tons of Chinese steel is what we could get every time at this nominal exchange rate we traded a ton of US steel. And so this is another way of saying that in this particular context, the Chinese steel, or more generally Chinese goods, are cheap. So if we have a real exchange rate that is bigger than 1, what this is saying, again, in our framework, we're describing the nominal exchange rate as units of foreign currency per dollar. So this is conditional on following that framework. But if we say that the real exchange rate is bigger than 1, what we're saying is that foreign goods, or in this case, the Chinese goods, and services are relatively cheap from the perspective of the US. And another way to think about this, and again, we already knew this, so what this is another way of saying, and we're going to just kind of keep seeing this again and again and again as we go through these notes, is that what the purchasing manager should do is buy steel from China because it's relatively cheap. One way to get at this, sorry, well, nuts. Let's see if I can get my little, there we go. Another way to think about this, so again, we had from my scribbling before that because the real exchange rate is bigger than 1, we are saying that Chinese goods, more generally, are relatively cheap. So I don't mean flimsy, I mean less expensive. And we already knew this from our earlier examples, so it's just comforting that we come up with the same answer. But the way that we could think about this is that if we had $3,000 we could take that, of course, and buy 1 ton of US steel. But given that the exchange rate is 7 yuan per dollar, we can take this $3,000 and we can get the exchange rate times 3,000 as yuan. So in other words, we can get 21,000 yuan, and with that, we can buy 1.5 tons of Chinese steel. So again, this is where that 1.5 is coming in. So when it is the case that our framework is that the nominal exchange rate is units of foreign currency per dollar, then when we see the real exchange rate being bigger than 1, or more generally, as we're going to see, rising, then it's going to mean that foreign goods and services are becoming relatively cheaper. Now, what we can do with this is we can move from just talking about one particular good or service to talking about the macroeconomy as a whole. So this is what we have on the next slide. So what is conventionally done in order to move from looking at a real exchange rate on a single good basis to gauging the overall competitiveness of a macroeconomy is to substitute an average price level. So now we go back to our earlier notes. So an average price level is like the CPI or the deflator or the personal consumption expenditures price index. So we take one of those measures of an average price level in the United States and in the foreign country, and we substitute that in this equation for the real exchange, for the individual goods prices that we had in the real exchange rate. So this now we introduce another subscript that you're going to see kind of going through the rest of these notes. The F here is standing for in the foreign country. So in this particular case, if we had this being China, then we would have the average price level in the United States divided by the average price level in China. So goodness, this is twitchy. I'm twitchy, I guess. So again, just to see exactly the same thing that we had before, what is the nominal exchange rate? The nominal exchange rate is units of foreign currency per US dollar. And if we think about a measure of an average price level, it's telling us in current dollar terms what the price is on average of all goods and services in the macroeconomy, and then the same interpretation would be here in the denominator for an average price level in a foreign country. And so again, we have the same sort of observation. The dollars are going to cross out, the units of the foreign currency are going to be crossing out, and what we are canceling. And what we're left with is that the real exchange rate is measuring for us the rate at which we can trade one country's goods and services for another country's goods and services. So with that, what we can do is introduce, I guess, a theory, a hypothesis, a relationship that's known as purchasing power parity, sometimes abbreviated PPP. So sometimes in things you'll see real gross domestic product expressed on a PPP basis, for instance. So that means that there's been an inflation correction, and then for international comparison purposes, an attempt to control for differences in prices between countries. So purchasing power parity is a premise that the nominal exchange rate should reflect differences in purchasing powers in countries. So the nominal exchange rate should adjust, meaning move up or down, so that every country, every currency will be able to buy the same basket of goods and services. So, in other words, the nominal exchange rate, which again is units of foreign currencies, say per US dollar, should be equal to the ratio of the relative prices in the two countries. Or, in other words, if we were going to form a prediction of what the nominal exchange rate should be, the nominal exchange rate should be the one that allows us to buy the same set of stuff in different countries once we're converted to the respective currencies. So our prediction is that the nominal exchange rate should take this value. And so another way to think about this is that if purchasing power parity is satisfied, then the real exchange rate numerically is 1. How do we know that? Well, we know that because the real exchange rate is equal to the nominal exchange rate times the ratio, say, of prices in the US relative to prices on average in the rest of the world. And if it is the case, or in the foreign country, and if it is the case that the nominal exchange rate correctly reflects those prices, then we would have P, the nominal exchange rate would be the average price level in foreign country relative to the average price level in the US. To get the real exchange rate, we would then be multiplying by this. So that's that part, and this is this part. And of course, everything cancels out, and we're left numerically with 1. So why should this happen? Why should this make sense? Why should it be the case that if purchasing power parity holds, then the real exchange rate is 1? Well, the reason we think about this is arbitrage. So, arbitrage is the idea that if you have identical goods and you see a spot where the price of them is low in one place and high in another, some enterprising soul, maybe you, is going to go buy where the price is low and bring that good to the place where the price is high. So, for example, suppose we just talk about potatoes before we go back to talking about steel. Um, if we were going to think about potatoes, we could imagine there are potatoes in Ireland and there are potatoes in Idaho. Suppose that the price of Irish potatoes is relatively low compared to the price of Idaho potatoes. Well, what an enterprising person would do would be to go to Ireland, buy potatoes where the price of potatoes is low, and bring them to Idaho where the price of potatoes is relatively high. Now, what does that do? In Ireland, the act of buying potatoes is increasing the demand for potatoes, and so that would serve to drive up the price of potatoes in Ireland. And in Idaho, when you bring more potatoes in and increase the relative supply, that's going to drive down the price in Idaho. And so we would expect that this arbitrage process would serve to make Irish potatoes and Idaho potatoes have the same price when they're expressed in a common currency. And that's just another way of saying that the real exchange rate is 1. Similarly, if we were going to think about what would happen if we observe that you can get 1.5 tons of Chinese steel in exchange for 1 ton of US steel, or that Chinese steel, in other words, is cheaper than US steel, what we would expect with the passage of time is that people would buy more of the Chinese steel, tending to drive up its price, buy less of the US steel, tending to depress its price, and that would tend to drive the real exchange rate back to its longer run value of 1. So, what do we see empirically? Do we see that in the long run, the real exchange rate is 1? We get a mixed bag, and we'll talk about why this is in just a moment. So, this is one measure of a trade weighted value of the dollar. This is the series that the authors reference in I don't know, figure 14, something that we're going to come to a little bit later on in these notes. So I went in and went to the St. Louis Fed website, pulled this data series. And so this is just like we tend to do sometimes, grossed up by a factor of 100. So saying that the real exchange rate should be 1, we're just grossing it up by 100. So I have this red dotted line at the level of 100. And what do you see? Well, if you stand way far back, you might convince yourself, and if we had a broader time span, you may even be more enthusiastic about this, that on average, the real exchange rate is 1. So we have this protracted period, say from roughly 2006 to 2015, where the real exchange rate is below 1. And then we have an extended period from 2015 more or less to the present, where the real exchange rate is above 1. And maybe in some, sort of long run average, it averages out to be 1, or in this case, 100. Um, so is the real exchange rate always 1? No, clearly it's not. Clearly, in the case of looking at the trade weighted value of the dollar. So trade weighted means we look at the value of the dollar compared to several different currencies where it's weighted by the proportion of trade that the countries do with the United States. And you could read more details about this on the St. Louis website if you were interested. But we see protracted periods where the value of the dollar is relatively low in real terms. So here we have the value of the dollar being relatively low. And then, of course, up here in this period, we have the real exchange rate being bigger than 1. And so uh, we can't say that purchasing power parity holds at each moment in time. We may be able to convince ourselves that in the very long run, on average, purchasing power parity holds. And that sort of would make sense because it takes a while for that arbitrage process to work out. And in the meanwhile, international transactions are going to be buffeted by lots of other things that are happening. Additionally, and importantly, for the idea of purchasing power parity and associated arbitrage to drive the real exchange rate to be equal to 1 requires a lot of assumptions or a lot of things to be true. So we, first of all, have to have perfectly competitive markets. And we spent some time at the beginning of the semester talking about what those assumptions are and the sense in which they might be more of an ideal than a day-to-day reality. We have to have perfectly free and open trade. So no trade barriers, no quotas, no tariffs, no nothing. And of course, that's patently false. We cannot allow the existence of transportation costs or any other kinds of transactions costs. So again, in our story with potatoes in Ireland and Idaho, there was nothing that was preventing the person to go to Ireland and buy cheap potatoes and bring them to Idaho where they were more expensive. And you notice that I sort of glossed over boats or steamer cargo ships and other kinds of things because I was just assuming them away for sake of discussion. And then additionally, and this is a fairly subtle point, but still is one that's relevant, is that the market basket that defines the average price level in the two countries. So again, remember that we said the real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate times the ratio of the average price level in the US relative to the average price level abroad. Um, the average price levels would have to be constructed with basically the same market basket, the same types of goods and services and the same weights. And that's also something that does not hold. The typical market basket for a Chinese consumer, for instance, and that goes into the calculation of an average price index in China is going to be different from the typical market basket for a US citizen. So that doesn't mean we necessarily throw this whole thing away. It would have been a colossal waste of time for me to have talked about it in that case. So, what I want to suggest to you is that even though we for purchasing power parity to hold requires a whole set of very specific assumptions, it's, on the other hand, still a useful framework for identifying instances in which currencies are likely to be over or undervalued and perhaps make predictions about the future long run exchange rate movements. So, for instance, I would predict if I saw that the real exchange rate between the US and China was 1.5, I would predict that that nominal exchange rate would have to fall. So, in order to think about that, we're going to turn to yet another kind of calculation. So, and what I want to sort of anticipate going a little bit farther ahead is that we can also have some fun with this concept of purchasing power parity. So, I'll show you what I think of as being a fairly lighthearted example. So at this point, what you're going to see is I'm going to pause here for a clicker question, so or a participation question. So the framework will be this. Let's suppose that initially the price in the U.S. Average price level in the U.S. is $40 per U.S. goods, and we have this similar sort of idea for Japan, and then we're going to suppose that prices in the U.S. rise from on average $40 per set of US goods and services to $80. If purchasing power parity holds, what would you predict would happen to the yen dollar nominal exchange rate? So what you should have found is, well, actually, I'll just leave that alone. You can refer to the solution that's in that I'll post on Canvas. But what I want to do is do the same sort of thing, but in the context of our example with General Electric. So you, as the purchasing manager, have already determined that you should be buying Chinese steel. But let's think about this, one more time as to why that might be true. And what we're going to see is that you could use this idea of purchasing power parity to predict a nominal exchange rate and then compare that to the nominal exchange rate that you observe and draw a conclusion. So that's what we're going to do. So what we can do under the guise of purchasing power parity is to say that if purchasing power parity holds, then it has to be the case that the real exchange rate numerically is 1. Goods and services trade at par for one another. And if that is the case, then it means that the nominal exchange rate is going to be a reflection of the average price level in the foreign country relative to the average price level abroad. Excuse me, the average price level in the foreign country relative to the average price level in the US. So in our example, what would we predict, according to purchasing power parity, the exchange rate between China and the US to be? Well, what we would do is we would plug in our relevant prices. So our predicted nominal exchange rate would be the yuan price of steel. And so that would be, would be 14,000 yuan per ton of steel. And we would divide that by the US price, so that would be $3,000 per ton of steel. And so if we could straight up trade steel for steel at par, or at if purchasing power parity were holding, then we would predict that the nominal exchange rate would be 4.67, dividing 3,000 into 14,000. What would be our units? yuan per dollar. And so we have, in fact, here a nominal exchange rate of 7 yuan per dollar. So again, in terms of a picture, I can make that work. Here would be casting back again to the first set of notes. We put on the horizontal axis the quantity of dollars traded in the foreign exchange market. And on the vertical axis, we put the nominal exchange rate, which is yuan per dollar. We noted that we could talk about the determination of the exchange rate by the interaction of the supply and the demand for the country's currency. And we'll talk about this in the next set of notes. But what we would be predicting, so purchasing power parity is predicting that the exchange rate should be 4.67 yuan per dollar. So in other words, here. But what we're told is that the exchange rate is 7 yuan per dollar. So what do we observe? What we observe, again, is that the quantity supplied of dollars at this exchange rate 7, so this is the actual exchange rate. This is the one that we would predict according to purchasing power parity. What we observe is that, in fact, at this exchange rate, we would observe that the dollar is overvalued. We already knew that. What does that mean? Again, if we say that the US dollar is overvalued, in this case relative to the yuan, then what that means is that US stuff is relatively expensive. And in this case, Chinese stuff, goods and services, is relatively cheap. And so we would predict, maybe with the passage of time, that the dollar would depreciate in nominal terms to this one that would be consistent with purchasing power parity. So for a refresher on this, go back to the first set of notes where I tried to draw the distinction between the market for dog food and the market for foreign exchange. When we have a price that's above what would be the implied equilibrium price, we say that that thing that's being traded is overvalued or too expensive. So in this particular case, when the exchange rate is 7 yuan per dollar, that leads to, or the implication of that is that the dollar is overvalued on a purchasing power parity basis. Oops. So this, I'm going to write it in here. This would mean that the US dollar is overvalued according to purchasing power parity, because the implied exchange rate is below the one that is actually prevailing. So, and indeed, oops, sorry. So here we had this, I had already drawn it out and I forgot, lost my brain. So what do we have? I mean, we have what I'm going to sort of box out here, a lot of different ways of saying exactly the same thing. If you're the purchasing manager in this particular example, you should buy Chinese steel. So we saw that you should buy Chinese steel because the dollar price of Chinese steel was less than the dollar price of US steel. We saw that the yuan price of US steel was higher than the yuan price of Chinese steel. So that was our earlier example. We see that we get relatively more units of Chinese steel for every 1 unit of US steel. So that real exchange rate is bigger than 1, that also tells us that Chinese goods and services are relatively cheap. The purchasing power parity implied exchange rate is below the actual one. So again, we would say the US dollar is overvalued, and US stuff, goods and services, are relatively expensive compared to Chinese stuff, which is relatively cheap. So these are all equivalent ways of thinking about this phenomenon. Again, if all you had was a very simple example like this, and I ask you, say on a quiz, which I think is entirely plausible, what would you do? It's probably just as easy to take the approach that we began with at the beginning of the notes. But if it is the case that you wanted to say something more about a country's overall competitiveness, and you don't want to look at the hundreds of thousands of goods and services that a particular country produces, and calculate their individual real exchange rates, the looking at the overall real exchange rate for an economy can give you some insight to that. Now, there is a hidden slide in these notes that not like it's secret or anything, but just has another way of calculating the real exchange rate. So the Bank of International Settlements constructs one, the Bureau of Economic Analysis constructs a real exchange rate, and there's probably many others. I would assume the World Bank and the IMF have their own kind of versions of this. So they show similar trends. It's kind of like having different measures of the average price level. You see the similar sort of qualitative predictions, but the numbers might be a little different. There is a fun version of this, which is constructed by The Economist magazine. So if you're not in the habit of reading The Economist, and you are interested in political science and economics in particular, and business as well, I can't recommend this magazine enough to you. And what the premise of the Big Mac Index is that the economist is saying, okay, what would be an example of a good that, at least figuratively, is traded all the world over, that we could reasonably expect might display the properties of purchasing power parity. And so what they hit upon, for better and worse, is McDonald's Big Mac. So no matter where you are, you can pretty predictably go into a McDonald's and get a hamburger. Although I will say I have put New Zealand in here because when I was in New Zealand, that was really the best Big Mac I think I've ever had. So anyway, I digress. So what the Economist magazine does is it looks at the price of Big Macs around the world and determines a purchasing power parity implied value of the exchange rate, can compares that to the actual exchange rate to draw a conclusion about whether currencies are over or undervalued. And there is, if you really wanted to dig deep into The Economist, there are people who have written doctoral theses about the exchange rate implications, trends in exchange rates that are implied by the Big Mac index. So it is something that it at the same time is both lighthearted as well as very deep. The article that I have linked here, this one, is really cool because it's interactive. So much has changed since the last time I looked at the Big Mac Index, and this website has this interactive feature to it, so you can play around with different countries' currencies. In fact, it may be handy for you for your country study. And then a related use of the Big Mac Index is what's provided in this second link. But if you really wanted to play around with what I'm doing here, I would encourage you to go check that out. So, for example, in the United States, the local price of a Big Mac, I think they look at 5 U.S. cities and construct the average. In 2020, this is from July of 2020, and so it's probably from January or so, was $5.71. So of course there's no exchange rate between the US, but I wanted to just put that row in there. In the UK, the local price of a Big Mac is 3.39 pounds per Big Mac, British pounds per Big Mac. And the US Big Mac price, of course, is the one that I described. So the purchasing power parity implied value of the exchange rate, again, we said the real exchange rate would be the price in the foreign country divided by the price in the US. So you get this, you get this by taking 3.39 pounds per Big Mac and dividing that by $5.71 cents per Big Mac, and you come up with the predicted value of the exchange rate of 0.59 pounds per dollar. The actual exchange rate at the time that they constructed this was 0.79 pounds per dollar. So again, there are only a couple of instances in which purchasing power parity holds exactly in that study, and so what do we conclude? We would conclude, much like in our example with the Chinese and U.S. steel, that the dollar is overvalued relative to the British pound. So overvalued because the actual exchange rate, actual nominal exchange rate, is bigger than the one that we would predict according to purchasing power parity. So in contrast, for Switzerland, the Swiss franc Big Mac price was six and a half. We have the dollar price. You can figure out then the purchasing power parity implied value of the nominal exchange rate. Compare that to the actual one, and here you can see now that the Swiss franc is overvalued relative to the dollar, or the dollar is undervalued relative to the Swiss franc. And so what we would predict is, over time, we should expect to see the dollar drop over the very long run, the dollar drop relative to the British pound and rise relative to the Swiss franc. So it's kind of fun to just kind of keep track of these things. I mean, fun to the extent that I find it fun. And with that, what I'm going to do is pause for a clicker question here, focusing on this last row, New Zealand. And you can get all of the answers to the New Zealand question by going to, again, this site. So we have a couple more things that we need to do. One is to begin to link or go back to our earlier discussion of the relationship between exchange rates and net exports. So given, I want to be clear that most of what we're saying here is conditional on describing the nominal exchange rate as units of the foreign currency per dollar. So in that particular case, if we see an increase in the real exchange rate, we would say that the US dollar has appreciated in real terms. And what does that mean? Well, that means, again, that foreign stuff is becoming relatively cheaper from the perspective of the U.S. So if you think about this, again, we saw that suppose that the real exchange rate between the U.S. and China went from 1 to our example of 1.5. So when the real exchange rate was 1.5, tons of Chinese steel per ton of US steel, we said that meant that foreign stuff, in this case Chinese steel, was relatively cheap compared to from the perspective of the US. And so what would that tend to do? That would tend to lead to higher imports into the US from the rest of the world. And indeed, in our example, we said we should buy steel from China. We should import more steel from China. And from the perspective of the rest of the world, as there is a real appreciation of the US dollar, US stuff is becoming relatively more expensive. And so, other things equal, that should lead to lower exports from the US to the rest of the world. And so, what we would predict is that as we see a real appreciation of the dollar, then net exports should be falling. So, if there is an increase in the real exchange rate, then this should lead to a decline in the US's net exports. And so, do we see that? Yes, we do. So let's see. This is figure 14 on from the textbook, and what you can see is the real exchange rate in blue. So it's scaled relative to the 2011 level, and the reason that and the real exchange rate measure that's being used is the same one that I presented back several slides ago. So what do we observe? We can observe that, of course, when the dollar is appreciating in real terms, we see an erosion in net exports. When the dollar is depreciating in real terms, we see an increase in net exports. And similarly, so appreciation in real terms, decline in net exports, decline in real terms of the US dollar, increase in net exports. So it's not perfect because there are other things that are happening in the macro economy, but it is the case that we can pretty confidently say that if the real exchange rate changes, then this is going to affect net exports. And this will be important for what we take up in our discussion of business cycles later on. So where does that leave us? We can do a quick summary and then we can look ahead to the next set of notes. So by way of summary, what is the real exchange rate? The real exchange rate is telling me the nominal exchange rate adjusted for the fact that different currencies have different purchasing powers in their respective countries because prices are different. So the real exchange rate is telling us a measure of competitiveness of an economy compared to another. When the real exchange rate depreciates, then it's going to be the case that Americans are going to import less and export more. So, in other words, we would see an increase in US net exports and vice versa. And so, by way of reminder, we have this equation or this expression for what the real exchange rate is. So, looking ahead to literally the next set of notes, what can we observe? If we wanted to explain what's happening to net exports, we could say, well, that's happening because there's a change in the real exchange rate, and the real exchange rate itself is going to change either because there's a change in relative prices. So, that's this part, or due to changes in the nominal exchange rate. That's that part. And this is what I want to focus on in the next set of notes. The nominal exchange rate, as we have seen, but not sort of analyzed, is going to be determined by the interaction of the demand and supply of a country's currency. And so, therefore, changes in the demand for a country's currency or in the supply of a country's currency in the foreign exchange market, or both, will lead to a change in the nominal exchange rate. And if the nominal exchange rate changes, then all else equal, we'll see a change in the real exchange rate and trade patterns. So the next set of notes are going to explore what are the things that cause changes in the nominal exchange rate.